All right, so today I'd like to present some thoughts Suzanne and I have had on the importance of veridical perceptions in NDEs. Veridical perceptions are accurate, verified perceptions of the material realm during a near-death experience. They are important because they provide objective confirmation of the reality of the NDE. In our opinion, they clearly show that the hypothesis that the NDE's consciousness separates from the physical body is the only viable explanation for NDEs. You can read more about our research at our website, selfconsciousmind.com. So what's going on in near-death experience? First of all, there are striking phenomenological aspects of NDEs. NDEs report that they have hyperreal perceptions. The locus of perception is outside the physical body, generally viewing things from above the physical body. They have apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, or AVPs. This is a term coined by Jan Holden for accurate, verified perceptions of the physical environment during an NDE. So AVPs, apparently non-physical veridical perceptions. Memories, another characteristic is memories of the experience are indelible. Generally, their memories are clear and unchanging even decades after the experience. Frequently, the NDE occurs when brain function is compromised or stopped, as with anesthesia, coma, or cardiac arrest. Now, there are two opposing explanatory hypotheses to explain these effects. Electrical activity in the brain is producing these effects, or the person's consciousness or mind has separated in some way from the body. So, John Fisher is a project leader of the recently completed $5 million Immortality project, which some of you may have heard of, which funded scientific and philosophical studies of the possibility of the afterlife. In a recent paper critiquing Pim van Lommel's theory of non-local consciousness, Fisher conceded that any complete explanation of NDEs must account for all aspects of all NDEs. Now, this is a very important principle in our view, that all of the elements, all of the details of each different NDE need to be accounted for and consistent with the explanation. So, considering the variety of physiological conditions NDEs occur in, from the NDE being completely healthy to in cardiac arrest death, this would be a daunting task for a materialist theory that the brain produces consciousness. So I want to cover the highlights of the research efforts on veridical perceptions in NDEs over the past 3 decades. These are the highlights. Starting with Michael Sabom, who worked with Sarah Kreuziger, published in 1982, a prospective in-hospital study of patients with a crisis event or who were near death. At that time, visual targets had not been proposed, and they analyzed 32 near-death experience accounts with AVPs. In 6 cases, the description of the resuscitation was sufficiently detailed and could be compared against medical records. And they were accurate in nearly every detail, and much better than compared with control patients without an NDE. Jan Holden is a leading researcher in near-death studies, and she has made significant contributions to the study of veridical perceptions. In fact, we might call her the mother of veridical AVP studies. In 1988, she proposed the use of double-blind visual targets placed near the ceiling in hospital rooms dynamically generated. And she analyzed the best placement of the targets and the best kinds of images. In 2009, Jan published a seminal article of 93 analysis of 93 AVP cases reported in the literature, and 92% were completely accurate, 6% had minor errors, and one case was entirely inaccurate. And she's now in the process of replicating that study. Since 1990, AVP research has been dominated by prospective studies with targets. From 1990 through 2008, there were 5 separate studies. Mostly they focused on cardiac arrest patients. There were only a few NDEs reported, and no reports of seeing any of the targets. They all had targets, and there were no reports of seeing any of the targets. But there was one notable vertical perception report in Penny Sartori's study in 2008. And in Penny Sartori's study, she also evaluated recollection of resuscitation events against controls, replicating essentially Michael Sabom's 1982 analysis with better selection of comparative controls. So it really reinforced Sabom's conclusions and answered some of the critics' questions about the original study. And she also compared hallucinations versus NDE perceptions and found that there were large differences in the characteristics of hallucinations versus NDE perceptions. And finally, the AWARE study, whose initial results were reported in 2014, as it was at the time of its initial results, had been going on for 4 years in hospitals in North America and in Europe. In this case, they considered only cardiac arrest cases in this study. And after 4 years, as Bruce Grayson reported this morning, there were 2,060 cardiac arrests, 101 survived enough to be and could be interviewed in depth. There were 9 NDEs, with only 1 NDE with AVPs, but there was no target in the room. So, from the beginning of research on NDEs, the assumption has always been that NDEs occur mostly when there is a close brush with death. That's why we call it near-death experience. Therefore, cardiac arrest was assumed to be the best model of NDEs, most closely resembling actual death. In a cardiac arrest, there's no blood flow to the brain, and that results in a complete shutdown of all brain activity, including the brainstem. Therefore, any veridical perceptions during cardiac arrest imply perceptions not involving physical senses. And hyperreal perceptions and indelible memory formation could not occur without robust brain function. So cardiac arrest with AVPs, with veridical perceptions, should not occur together. And furthermore, there was a 1990 analysis of NDEs that found that NDEs occurring closer to death have more features involving perceiving light. But cardiac arrest is also problematic when using it exclusively to study NDEs. There are very few survivors, as the AWARE study certainly showed, fewer who can be interviewed, and fewer still who can be followed up. They also observe a lower incidence of NDEs in cardiac arrest versus other conditions. And it's more and more getting down to 10% of all survivors have had an NDE. And in the AWARE study, it was 9%. Memory deficits also occur in cardiac arrest survivors, and this is probably, at least in our estimation, due to damage to the hippocampus. And there is new research indicating that cardiac arrest may not be the best model for NDEs. So, in the balance of this talk, I want to cover several topics that are moving the study of AVPs forward. And there's, first of all, new news, at least to just about everybody in the field. New analysis of NDEs in coma cases compared with non-life-threatening cases, and a new analysis of the quality of memories in NDEs. Interestingly, these were both done by the same team in the University of Liège, Belgium. And secondly, I'd like to take a fresh look at AVPs from several different perspectives, which we'll get into. And also another perspective we want to bring, which is, are NDEs objectively real? And finally, I want to touch on and look at the future of AVP investigation. So, the first bit of new news. This study by researchers at the University of Liège in Belgium compared 140 NDEs in coma patients, that is NDEs with coma from cardiac arrest, from severe illness like meningitis, severe trauma, drowning, and so on. So the patient is in coma, has an NDE. Comparing those 140 with 50 NDEs from non-life-threatening events, such as during sleep, fainting, meditation, and drug or alcohol use, and others, which we have in the field been calling near-death-like experiences. And they had a very interesting and surprising result, that there is no difference. No difference from an NDE occurring in coma to an NDE occurring during meditation. No difference in the intensity measured by the Grayson NDE score, and no difference in content measured by the number of NDE elements between the non-life-threatening NDEs and coma, or what they called in the report, real NDEs. So what does this mean? This implies, well, our conclusion is that closeness to death and various physiological factors are not determinative of NDEs. And if you remember back just a couple slides ago, this contradicts the 1990 analysis of NDEs that found the closer to death, the deeper the NDE. And we reviewed that analysis in some detail, and our opinion is that the present study is a stronger analysis, much stronger analysis. So this implies that all NDEs involve a common state of consciousness. There's a commonality of the intensity and content in the NDEs in a wide range of physiological conditions. So a common state of consciousness arising from a number of different physiological conditions implies that there is a common proximate or immediate cause of the experience. A common cause. A proximate cause, meaning immediately before the NDE. A common mechanism of all NDEs. There could be any number of things that trigger the common mechanism that results in the NDE. A trigger may occur, for example, in cardiac arrest, from cardiac arrest, but if the proximate cause is absent, which occurs in 80% of the cases, or more than 80% in the case of cardiac arrest, no NDE occurs. So if you have a trigger and you're missing the proximate cause, then there's no NDE. If you have the trigger and you have the proximate cause, then there is an NDE. And we suggest that the common proximate cause is in fact the separation of a person's consciousness from their physical body. implying that consciousness is a non-material aspect of a person that can separate from the physical body. The requirement of cardiac arrest, per se, is irrelevant to the NDE itself. But having flatline brain activity is very helpful to demonstrate conclusively that the brain could not be responsible for the experience. So studying cardiac arrest should not be abandoned, but we feel that the study of NDEs needs to be broadened. Okay, the second bit of new news is another study by researchers from the University of Liège. Stephen Loris is the principal investigator in both cases. This study compared the memories of NDEs with memories of others who were in coma without an NDE. So what do you remember? You who have had an NDE, describe your memory and so on. And the characteristics that they were looking at included how many sensory details, how much the NDEer mentally relived the events when remembering, or the non-NDEer, how much the NDEer remembered being involved in the event, and how much the NDEer felt the emotions of the event when remembering. So if you actually experienced something, if you actually saw something, then you would have lots of details. You would have emotional involvement. You would feel yourself reliving what you did in the events of the NDE, and you would feel being, reliving it and being involved in the event. So they found significantly more of these characteristics in NDEs. The NDE memories had extremely high emotional content. They were more vivid and real to the NDEer, even compared with memories of recent real events. And that, of course, supports the idea that they are more real. They are hyperreal. And the NDEer remembered being more involved in the event than the non-NDE coma patient. So the conclusion that the researchers came to was that NDEs cannot be considered as typical imagined event memories. The NDEer really perceived these phenomena. Now, there's a difference between imagining something, building an imagination in your mind, and experiencing, perceiving the event or the object. And this contradicts the skeptics' assertions that NDEs are dreamlike memories of events that never happened, or are altered memories of real events which were partly or fully imagined, which is the standard explanation for the brain production hypothesis. Oh, you had these hyperreal experiences, but they were just memories, dreamlike memories, or your imagination where you filled in various things from before your NDE or after, before your period of unconsciousness or after your period of unconsciousness, and they really were hallucinations. In contrast, the NDEer remembers being actively involved in the event. The researchers suggest that what makes the NDEs unique is the perception of the experience itself. The NDE events were really perceived. And this implies that the veridical perceptions, the AVPs, are not imaginations or confabulations or lucky guesses, but they were actually perceived as well. And one would expect that if you have really verified perceptions that match what actually happened or match the objects that were there, then they would have been actually perceived. Okay, I want to introduce an important new resource book on NDEs that we're really excited about. It's a book that was published in Dutch in 2013 by NDE researchers Titus Rivas, Annie Durven, and Rudolf Schmidt. It summarizes 78 verified cases of veridical perceptions and other paranormal events in NDEs. The cases were selected only if they had been verified by an independent third party, usually an NDE researcher or a physician. And many of you may know that IANS is translating and will publish this book in English. The authors are adding several new cases. The English edition will have about 90 cases. And IANS is still asking for donations to complete the publication and to publicize the book, and at ians.org/translate. So I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about, giving you a summary of the book's content. In particular, its treatment of AVPs. And in the first 3 chapters of the book, the authors distinguish 3 types of AVPs. First, AVPs in the immediate environment, AVPs of events or objects beyond the reach of physical senses, and AVPs during cardiac arrest. So AVPs in the immediate environment, there are 10 cases in the book. There may be a few more now. Haven't got an exact count yet. And a typical case is the case of Al Sullivan, who was in cardiac bypass surgery. He was under anesthesia. His eyes were taped shut, and his head was behind a surgical drape, completely covering his, whatever, if his eyes had been open, whatever his field of view would have been. And he was in an NDE. He floated out near the ceiling. He saw the doctors with his hands on his hips, flapping his arms like this, both arms. And he would, and this was, the surgeon was giving directions to the surgical team. And he had his hands on his hips to avoid touching something that might spread infection or something. So this was a purely visual, idiosyncratic movement that could not have been seen. And the doctors involved have no explanation of how he could have seen this, because he said, oh, the doctor was flapping his arms. The second type of AVPs are events or objects beyond the reach of physical senses, 14 cases plus, probably. The first obvious one is Maria's shoe, which was, Maria was a Mexican migrant worker in Seattle, had a heart attack, was in the hospital, then she suffered a cardiac arrest and had an NDE. She floated out of the window and up a floor and around the different side of the hospital and saw a blue tennis shoe with a worn spot and a shoelace tucked under it on a window ledge. And social worker Kim Clark-Sharp, who was at the conference here, found it exactly as described. The second typical case is the 1985 quarter. An 82-year-old patient had a heart attack and had an NDE and floated out of his body and saw a 1985 quarter on the right-hand corner of an 8-foot-high monitor amidst the dust. And the doctor in charge, Dr. Lerma, climbed the ladder and found it as it had been described. And the third case is a 12-digit serial number at the top of a 6-foot respirator. A coma patient had an NDE, and this patient had an obsession about memorizing numbers and saw and memorized the 12-digit serial number. Those patients, we want to have more NDE cases from them. Okay, and she recited it back, and Norma Bowe wrote it down. Custodian later dusted the top of the machine and recited the number exactly as it had been written. Okay, and the third type of AVPs are during cardiac arrest. There are probably 34 of these will ultimately be, my guess. but two recent cases that aren't in the Dutch edition that are going to be added. One is Dr. Lloyd Rudy's patient. Had a heart valve replacement operation, and the doctors could not get the patient off the heart-lung machine. After a long period of trying, the patient just could not hold a heartbeat, and so they declared the patient dead. The patient was there on the table there, no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no respiration for at least 20 minutes. And they had all the monitors still going. And they had, echo probe, and would have heard any heartbeat. There was none for 20 minutes. The surgeons took off their garb and were standing in the doorway in their short sleeves, and looking at what they could have done, discussing what they could have done differently. So the patient later, after the patient had been resuscitated and regained consciousness, recounted several veridical perceptions during this time, the surgeon standing in the doorway in short sleeves, and also Post-it notes that had been stuck together in a chain that were pasted to a computer monitor. And this was to give telephone messages to Dr. Rudy. And the second case, I'd like to highlight Dr. Belge's new book, which is coming out in October, Near Death in the ICU. We highly recommend it. We've read an advanced copy, and it is very instructive, not only because of the interesting cases that she recites, but every case and every chapter, she brings in instructive material for medical professionals about NDEs and how medical professionals should work with patients with an NDE. So in this particular case, patient Howard had a cardiac arrest. In his NDE, he saw the resuscitation clearly. He saw that Dr. Belge, who had just come in, called in by the code blue. She was wearing a lime green shirt. She fumbled to get her stethoscope out of her pocket, and as a result, pens fell onto the bed. The patient, Howard, recited several specific comments that Dr. Belge had made in putting in the intubation tube. Then Howard reported that he rose through the ceiling and felt the difference in density going through the ceiling, floor, and into the next room above. And in that room, he saw a very strange sight. He saw these mannequins on beds around the room, and he saw computer monitors in the center, and he couldn't understand these mannequins, and they had IVs stuck in them. He was describing the nurse training center that is situated exactly above the ICU. No way that he could have known that. Okay. And in addition to AVPs, the book has chapters on telepathic communication with a living person, 4 cases, communication with unknown deceased persons. These are all very interesting and evidential, but they're not veridical perceptions. Deceased loved ones giving paranormal information. NDE, now, the NDE appears as an apparition to others. We want to describe these 3 cases later. And psychic abilities after an NDE. The example we're giving here is Cheryl Lee Black, which is a new case that they're adding. Cheryl Lee gave a talk at the 2014 conference, which is on YouTube. And then cases of miraculous healing, and a good example is Anita Morjani's healing from lymphatic cancer, lymphoma. And Anita Morjani is going to be talking on Saturday. Okay, so that's the book, and when it comes out, it will be a really exciting book for adding to the the research data of the field, this field. Now I'd like to talk about establishing the timing and locus of perception. Okay, so first, the idea is to counter the skeptical arguments that perceptions of the NDE come from normal physiological processes either before or after the period of unconsciousness. And it's important to demonstrate both the timing and location and direction of the NDE's consciousness. So first of all, to establish where the NDE is located and the direction the percipient is viewing, we need to select unusual objects that are not physically possible for the NDE to see, objects not familiar with the NDE, unfamiliar with anyone else in the immediate environment, impossible for anyone immediately present to see, and or at a large distance. And of course, Maria Shu, the 1985 quarter, and the serial number cases all fit in this category. And of course, also, the hidden targets near the ceiling meet these criteria. And to establish when the NDE perceives something, we need to focus on unusual time-specific events, and you can correlate the event time with the NDE's physical condition. So, unusual events that are not physically possible for the NDE to observe or infer. If the NDE can correctly relate the sequence and details of the unfolding event, and if the researchers can match the time of the event with the NDE's physiological condition, the event occurring in the presence of the NDE but out of reach of physical senses, the event occurring beyond the NDE's physical presence, especially at a distance. And again, the cases of Al Sullivan and Lloyd Rudy's patient are of this type. And of course, hidden targets that have random compositions of visual elements changing over time meet these criteria. So the best cases will be a detailed, purely visual event or unusual object that is perceived at a distance or with physical vision blocked, that is contemporaneous with a known physiological condition, particularly of electrical flatline. For example, when the heart is stopped, especially if perceptions occurred prior to the onset of resuscitation, because skeptics can say, well, when you started heart massage, then that started blood flow, and of course, then there could be electrical activity, and so on. And then immediately verified by independent investigators, and this is the case with Lloyd Rudy's patient. That case meets all of those criteria. So skeptics fall back on neurological explanations for NDE phenomena. So are the neurological explanations viable, especially if they need to be able to explain all aspects of all NDEs? Well, first of all, no single physiological explanation fits all the cases, especially near-death-like cases, like during meditation or walking across the room or looking up at the sunrise. Or during sleep, and so on. And if you take any of these explanations, hypoxia, et cetera, endorphins, DMT, and so on, temporal lobe seizure, REM intrusion, there are many different triggers for an NDE, but none of these conditions fits even a large percentage of the cases of NDEs. And secondly, the subjective experiences, NDEs are not at all like the experiences reported in the proposed physiological factors. In particular, these other physiological factors do not have hyperreal experience. They don't have the sense of being in their true home, the NDE being in this true home, with unconditional love, no longer afraid to die. All of those characteristics are absent from any of the experiences that are brought forward, physiological experiences and conditions. And this is confirmed by cases where a person has experienced both the experiences, for example, of hypoxia induced by gravitational loss of consciousness and an NDE. For example, the experience of light in an NDE is much different from the experience of light caused by hypoxia. And in fact, there's no correlation of NDEs with physiological factors. For example, if hypoxia were really the cause of NDEs, then there would be a strong correlation between hypoxia and NDEs, but there isn't one. The same holds true of all the other proposed physiological causes. But the fact that there is no physiological correlation implies that there is a common proximate cause for NDEs, or at least that is likely. And another point is that consciousness is associated with sustained level of cortical electrical power. And this is something that researchers seem to ignore, and that is, neuroscientists seem to ignore, that where you see consciousness, there is a certain level of cortical electrical power. If you do an EEG on the skull, then and you look at just the EEG power at the level of the skull, the scalp, then there is a certain power that is there. And when that power drops below a certain level, there is no consciousness. And when you get to a person who is brain dead or in deep coma or persistent vegetative state, that power is not there. And so the isolated low-power synchronous electrical activity that some neuroscientists are proposing occurs in rats when they are being put to death and after they have had a cardiac arrest as a result. That level of electrical activity is not associated with any level of consciousness in rats or in humans. And finally, neurological explanations of accurate conscious perceptions of events at a distance during an NDE are a stretch. How are you going to account for seeing in the case of the patient Howard, seeing the NDE, the nurse training center, or another patient seeing leg amputation in the next surgical suite, adjacent surgical suite, and what happened, what they did with, to dispose of the leg, putting it in a particular color plastic receptacle. So you need to be able to explain having accurate perceptions that were physically impossible. You need to explain having accurate perceptions where the brain could not be functioning, and frequently those things happen together. All right. Now to address the other side of the coin, so if neurological explanations are not valid, are there objective validations of NDE, of the mind separation in near-death experiences? If the mind or locus of consciousness subjectively separates from the body, there should be some objective evidence, some other observer observing it, some objective effect that confirms it. Now, there are several different types of these. There's actually, I think, 6 different types, but the most evidential are 3 types of cases that suggest the separation is objectively real. The first one is simultaneous group NDEs, and there are a couple of cases like this in the literature. An interesting one is, and this occurs when multiple people have an NDE at the same time and observe one another. So simultaneous group NDEs. The accounts are consistent among the NDEers. For example, there were a force fighting team called the Hot Shots. They were caught by a shift in the winds that engulfed them in flames, and all experienced NDEs. So one of them, Jake, saw many of the others in his team out of their bodies. Miraculously, a number of them survived, and they had chosen to return. They all reported they had had similar NDEs, seeing one another. So that's an objective seeing of somebody else in an NDE. And then there is a shared NDE. So this is a case where a healthy person observes the transition out of body of the NDEer and observes other aspects of the event that match the NDEer's subjective experience. Okay, now, if you're familiar with the term shared death experience, SDE, shared death experience, shared NDE is very similar. In a shared death experience, there is a person who is dying. There is another person or several who are in attendance, present, who themselves experience elements that are very similar to an NDE. There's unusual light and music. They may observe a mist or shape leaving the person's body. Now the person is dying and actually dies. But then they are seem to be drawn out of their own body and observe the dying, and are with the dying person out of body, and they observe the life review of the dying person. There's a tunnel that opens. There's deceased relatives that come to escort the dying person. So that's a shared death experience. The person dies. In a shared near-death experience is the same thing, except that the dying person doesn't die, but just has an NDE. Okay? So in this particular case, Jan Price was having a heart attack at home. The EMTs were called. She suffered a cardiac arrest on the gurney, and immediately the EMTs, and during the EMTs resuscitation procedure, her husband, John, perfectly healthy, observed Jan's solid form leave her physical body, dressed in a flowing green gown. Then their recently deceased dog, Maggie, appeared briefly to John. So John saw Jan leave her physical body and rise up, and then he saw Maggie, their deceased beloved dog, briefly. He saw other things during the resuscitation. Now Jan experienced leaving her body, rising above it, and then her dog appearing. Jan had other veridical perceptions of her resuscitation, which were verified by the EMTs. So that's a case of a shared near-death experience where another person observes the same thing as the NDEer experienced, objectively observes. So now the third type, and that we're calling apparitional NDEs. Here the NDEer, and by the way, in the book there are 5 cases, or there will be 5 cases, 3 from previous centuries and 2 from contemporary times. The NDEer visits another person while out of body, communicates with them, and both accounts are verified as consistent with one another. So the 3 cases I'd like to share with you, one of them is from 1691, the case of Mary Gosse, G-O-S-S-E, which is sometimes reported erroneously as Goff, G-O-F-F-E, because the S's in those times look like F's. Anyway, it's a well-documented case that was published at the time, 1691, as a chapter of a book. It was based on a letter that the author of the book had received. So the case is that Mary was very ill, and she was located 9 miles from home and could not travel. and she knew she was dying. She wanted to see her children before she died. But they said, you can't do that because you can't even get up. And so she fell in a trance about 2 a.m., and the next morning she said she had been at home with her children. Now, that same night at 2 a.m., Mary was seen at the home by a nurse who was caring for the children, who saw Mary as an apparition for quite a number of minutes, 15 minutes, with her children. The second case is Olga Gearhart, a case that occurred in 1989. Olga Gearhart underwent heart transplant. And of course, at that time, heart transplant was pretty serious stuff. It still is, but it was very serious back then. And all of her family came to the hospital except her son-in-law, who didn't like being at the hospital. So the heart transplant went okay, but at 2:15 in the morning, her new heart stopped beating, and it took a long time, 3 hours, to resuscitate her heart beating again, and then longer still for her to recover consciousness. The son-in-law, who was sleeping at home, awoke at exactly 2:15 a.m., and Olga was standing at his bedside saying, "I'll be all right. There's nothing for any of you to worry about. Give this message to my daughter," which was his wife. He wrote down the message, the time of day, and like any person who's just seen an apparition, went back to sleep. Olga ultimately regained consciousness, and the first thing she said is, "Did you get my message?" And she had left her body and could not communicate with the family members, who were all asleep in the waiting room in the hospital, couldn't contact them, so she went to the son-in-law, and Melvin Morris verified these details, including the note that the son-in-law had scribbled. And the final case is Lauren Belge, cancer patient. Now, this case is not in her upcoming book, but will be in a subsequent research book. There was a woman dying of cancer, but refused to have her son visit. Her son had been estranged from the family for 25 years because of certain financial things that he had done which harmed the family. And so she told him, I guess indirectly, "No, I don't want to see you." So the son was sitting in a bar. His mother's dying. He's deep in remorse and regret and crying. He sees his mother coming into the bar. He's elated. He gets up to greet her, but she disappears. The mother wakes up and says, "I had the strangest dream. I saw my son in a bar. He got up and started to come to me. I got scared and woke up." Dr. Belge corroborated that all the details of the two stories matched. So in these cases, we have objective perception of the NDEer by a healthy person. Well, in the case of the apparitional ones, the healthy person, and the shared NDEs. So all of these cases, the three types of cases, where the out-of-body NDE is seen by someone else, are particularly compelling because it isn't just a subjective event. In the apparitional cases especially, the NDE has a strong desire to visit another person. They appear to the person and may communicate something. The interaction is corroborated in all details by both parties. These cases show the objective existence of the mind or spirit of the NDE, not just the subjective experience, especially one, where it is corroborated as happening at the same time, two, where all of the observed details match, and three, where information is communicated or the NDE's presence is made known. So, looking at the future of AVP investigation, we want to look at the AWARE study. We recommend that this approach, the AWARE study approach, be reevaluated. There are reasonable projections that it will take several decades to produce statistically meaningful results with the current configuration of the study. All you have to do is multiply the 4 years and the results of 4 years times 10, so 40 years, and so you might get 10 cases of AVP, 90 cases of near-death experience. But then you don't know whether their target is there and whether they actually looked at the target. So 40 years is a long time for a study to go. So the fact that no NDE looks in the direction of the target, in our opinion, does not prove or disprove anything, although skeptics would like to point differently to that. Doesn't prove anything if they don't look in the direction of the target, particularly in the light of the NDEs having many other accurate perceptions. The controlled experimental study is impractical because conditions can't be fully controlled. And contrary to what skeptics say, it is not necessary for scientific study for there to be controlled experiments like randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled experiments, like saying to Stephen Hawking, your study of black holes is not scientific because you haven't done a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study of your black holes, feeding stars into them and so on. Why haven't you? You're not being scientific. Okay. It's not necessary to restrict the study, to restrict study to cardiac arrest, and it takes too long to get results. All NDEs should be included, and if AVPs could not have been seen by ordinary physical senses, they are valid cases that should be included. And just compare what Penny Sartori and Lauren Belge and even Michael Sabom did with their prospective studies where they included all cases. So we are proposing a different different methodology, a single hospital investigation of all cases that likely have resulted in NDE. This could be done in conjunction with a graduate program. All rooms in the hospital should be equipped with visual targets, preferably driven by computers, so the images are constantly changing. And in these days, that's financially more feasible. It's important to interview all possible cases and document any unusual events, and verify and document all details in depth as soon as reported. And these are points that we made earlier regarding the AWARE study in 2009. We expect a very useful set of results where the targets are much more likely ultimately to be seen. If the target is seen, particularly if it's really unusual, et cetera, even if the person is not in cardiac arrest, it's still extremely evidential. So a final point, and that is what is going to lead to the eventual acceptance of the mind entity hypothesis, or this hypothesis of the separation of the mind from the body. Well, first of all, the study of AVPs is a critical first step. This is the only reasonable explanation, that is to say, the mind separation is the only reasonable explanation for veridical perceptions that are physically impossible to perceive, especially when the brain function is compromised. NDEs occurring in widely varied circumstances imply a common proximate cause applying to all cases. The most logical explanation is the separation of the mind from the body, consistent with the phenomenology of NDEs. And the only reasonable explanation is the only reasonable explanation that applies to all aspects of all NDEs in all of their details. And the weight of evidence from similar cases strongly counters the argument that such accurate perceptions could be due to fraud, confabulation, imagination, or all of the ad hoc arguments about specific NDE, AVP cases that skeptics like to bring up. And then the next step will be to identify and characterize the neurological interface between the mind and the brain. The evidence from AVPs is not going to convince everyone. It's not going to even convince, in my view, most of the neuroscientists. But if we can explain how the non-material mind interfaces with the brain, then that will get their attention, particularly because it has already has a broad explanatory power for several enigmas of consciousness, like what's called the hard problem of consciousness, but it's important to demonstrate how the interface actually works. This should result in an overall insight as to how the brain works and provide significant explanatory power for specific neurological problems. If we can start to add value to neuroscience and neuroscientific understanding of how the brain and consciousness work, then we will get acceptance. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, questions, yes, please.
Awesome presentation. Is this on?
It's not on.
I'll just talk loud.
No.
So, I really appreciate what you said about the proximal cause.
Proximal cause, yes.
And I think it's kind of funny, you're coming from an NDE camp, so you're calling it a near-death-like experience. I'm coming from an out-of-body experience camp, so we would qualify an NDE as a forced projection, if you will, as opposed to like a spontaneous, something that would happen in sleep versus like something done through a technique. I guess, though, coming from that perspective, that really what's important is that after you've kind of gotten past this proximal cause, you're out of the body, you're realizing yourself as a consciousness, an eternal consciousness, if you will, and seeing that all of those benefits are conserved regardless of your method of exit. Right? Overcoming fear of death and contacting your spiritual guidance, etc. So then, for designing a research paradigm, I was kind of surprised that you decided to take the NDE route. Because OBEs are trainable. Anyone in this audience if they've ever had an NDE or not, they can learn and practice techniques within maybe a month of training, can actually have an OBE. We're calling it a target, but it's not really a target because the participant is not in on it. Right? They go in because of a trauma or whatever. Right. Maybe they see it, maybe they don't. Whereas with an OBE practice, you can actually, through intentionality, specifically try to get to that target. So it maybe overcomes some of the untenable aspects for NDE research, but with the same end result benefit being that providing evidence of consciousness as not bodily based, basically.
Right, and those two approaches are complementary. I'm not aware of research, but you could probably help us with that, showing veridical perceptions reliably done in out-of-body experiences.
There is some. I'll tell you, it does have its own host of difficulties.
Right.
One being that we design these great stimuli as a target, and our faculties of perception when out of body are a little bit different.
Right.
Reading numbers and things like that can be very, very difficult.
And our view, they are complementary, and both avenues of research ought to be pursued, continue to be pursued. What's different in our view, this is just Suzanne Mays speaking, is that a near-death experience usually involves some sort of shock. Doesn't always, but but there seems to be a real or a greater separation, whereas a self-induced OBE does not have quite the same level of separation. That's just phenomenologically what appears to be, because there is with OBEs, the veridicality of the perceptions is not quite the same, whereas and the hyperreal and so on may not be the same. But if you can get somebody who can do veridical OBEs, that would be great.
Yeah, we should talk offline, but yeah, absolutely. I think that I would disagree with you a little bit that the veridicality is necessarily, of course, it depends on that. If it's a spontaneous projection, the person is not really lucid or fully lucid. It really comes down to the lucidity of the person when projected, not necessarily the method of exit.
Right. Well, that's exactly right in our view. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Louis Griggs, and I've had 2 NDEs, and I'm going to talk about them Sunday morning, but one of them, what fascinates me about the scientific look at things that I and you especially do, is that whereas my first NDE was the perfect one, and through the tunnel, pure light, total memory of everything, conversation with God, and blah, blah, blah. It's funny we can make small things out of it. So used to it now. Whereas the second one, it goes to the edge of this and doesn't yet have science, and that is it was a whitewater river accident and a left temporal lobe brain injury so severe that I was in a coma, and then took many years of hospitalized recovery. However, what you just helped remind me of is that after literally 15 years, because that accident was 97, and it was about a couple of years ago, I felt that even though I had no memory, there must be a way to rediscover the experience within me.
Right.
And so I had done 2 years of trauma therapy, and the person teaching me in the trauma therapy, facilitating me, took me to Peter Levine, who you must know of, who studied trauma therapy in the U.S., and he put me on stage in front of all of his therapists around the country and used me as a guinea pig to say, what would you like? What would you like? And I said, I would like you to take me back to the Whitewater River accident in the raft to see if it's possible to rediscover anything that happened. And he went, okay. And he put me into hypnotism, sort of like hypnotism. And out came memories, experiential memories, not perfect pictures, but what I call cellular experiential memories of when this 100-foot tall tree crushed my head, and all I was experiencing was the mind, body, and the spirit trying to live instead of die. And then there was a shift, and it shifted to tears on stage of a memory that once I was alive now and no longer had to worry about survival or not, even though I was still fractured skull and blood all over and tree on my head and roof, I had human emotion of, where's my son? Because my 10-year-old son had fractured skull and had gone out of the raft and was face down and drowning. And I had human tears on stage about that. And then there came a third stage, and then I'm done, where my son had been captured. Somehow I got he was alive, and now I could focus on the simpler thing about just trying to recover and from life. And all of those were clear cellular memories somewhere. And it just fascinates me to hear you. And I want to go, well, what kind of study could we do? I want to have studies of others who had similar experiences and who was watching, and did my memory match what actually happened, and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So I don't really have a question except,
Okay, well, I have some comments.
Yeah.
First of all, it's not uncommon, it's not unheard of, let's say it's fairly uncommon, for the person the NDEer to suppress the memory.
Of course.
And then something triggers it. And evidently it can also be brought out with hypnosis. But it could be, a sweat lodge, Dave Bennett, or it could be, just being asleep and then having a dream, and all of a sudden it all comes back. But then it all comes back, and so that's probably what happened. And it isn't just, it isn't specifically from the hypnosis, but in your case that was what helped recover that. But also, in our view, memories are not in the brain; they are in the mind. And so when you have an out-of-body experience, an NDE and an out-of-body experience, you are experiencing everything that you experience is not only being hyperreal, but is being indelibly recorded, if you would, in your mind. And then you may have trouble recalling it, particularly because you probably had hippocampal damage, at least on the left side. And in which case, you can't access that. And so it takes a little bit of effort to do that.
Yeah, a little. I wasn't even able to read, write, walk, or talk.
Right. Yeah. So you had severe brain injury. Yes.
But then was able to find it, and then I wondered why I couldn't have memory of it. That must have meant the brain was so damaged. And someone else who's mixed spirituality with all of us said, "No, Louis, I think your mind and body and spirit had to do everything possible to live instead of die. Yeah. So they weren't going to waste their time on memory. Even the mind wasn't."
But I think your memories were there. It just you hadn't accessed them yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.